welcome. This is Natso Batarku. I am the communications coordinator for ACMS. For those of you joining for the first time, the American Center for Mongolian Studies is a nonprofit educational organization that supports academic projects and exchanges between the United States and Mongolia. And this is the English panel version of our monthly virtual speaker series. As is our recent change in program, we host a lecture and a panel every month, and it's held in English on the odd months, so that's September, and Mongolian on the even months. So I do want to note that this session is being live streamed on Facebook, and a more abridged and Mongolian captioned edit will be published on our YouTube channel. And as our panelists are going to be presenting live, please mute your mics and leave your questions in the chat. We'll try to address them during the Q&A session. You can alternatively also open your mic, raise your hand, and do that. If you'd like to be informed about our future sessions, you can either join our mailing list that's behind me, bit.ly/VSS list, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. All right, so we're thrilled that our two speakers, Mr. Benjamin Meader and Dr. Anne-Sophie Pratte, have agreed to join us today to present on the emerging field of GIS in Mongolia, if I may say so myself. But it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, and I will share my screen once again to present a little bit about our speakers. If you can, oops, there it is. Okay. So Mr. Benjamin Meader is the director of Rumline Maps, a GIS and cartography consulting firm in the state of Maine. His company focuses on municipal urban planning, environmental consulting, and social science research support for academics. In the fall of 2013, Ben was awarded a library fellowship to bring geospatial technology and educational support to ACMS. During his stay, he created a geographic livestock census database, taught a 3-week GIS and cartography class, assisted Ariel Ahern in her doctoral work in Biohongor, and worked with the Asia Foundation on its Hora infrastructure inventory for Ulaanbaatar. I actually joined, I was one of the lucky students to be part of the 3-week GIS and cartography class, so really, it was really great. But he's also made several maps of Mongolia in the intervening years and hopes to get the opportunity to return sometime soon. All right. And I'll also follow up with both. So I'll do the biographies, introduce both our speakers, and then we'll go from there. So Dr. Anne-Sophie Pratte is our next speaker. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Social Science Research Council of Canada and a visiting scholar at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. She recently completed her doctoral degree in Inter-Asian and Altaic Studies at Harvard University, specializing in history. Her dissertation, Mapping the Steppe, The Politics of Cartography in Qing Mongolia, 1780 to 1911, examines the production of local maps in Khalkha Mongolia. She was affiliated with the ACMS in 2017 and 2018 while conducting research at the National Archives and the National Library of Mongolia. All right.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Thanks for the introduction.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. So without further ado, the floor is yours. And I believe Ben will first present on the general, give a general overview of the field of GIS. Okay.
Just start with a mini GIS lesson, and I hope that's okay. It's been a while since I've been to Mongolia. I was actually 8 years ago this September that I landed in Ulaanbaatar, and I knew nothing about Mongolia pretty much before I arrived. I was very excited to be there. But I think it's important to talk about map making because I think a lot of terms just kind of get thrown around. Map making, GIS, cartography, geo visualization, all this kind of stuff. So I'm just gonna do about 10 minutes of just a crash course in what GIS is. I'm gonna hand the reins over to Anne-Sophie, who's gonna talk about her doctoral work. And then I will come back in at the end and just give you a little recap of what I worked on back in 2013, which was some time ago now. So I hope you'll forgive me if I'm a little rusty. So I always start off with this picture. This is a picture called the Blue Marble picture. It was taken in 1972 on the Apollo 17 mission. It's about 18,000 miles from the Earth. And it's called the Blue Marble picture because the astronauts thought, I don't know if you can kind of see, if you can see my mouse, but it starts to look a little gibbous on the side here. It starts to look very kind of spherical. And the thought was that taking a nice picture of the Earth where it's fully illuminated or almost fully illuminated might help change the way people think about the Earth. And it did. This is one of the most reproduced images kind of all time. It's a very, very famous image. And you know, within only about 30 or 40 years, we've kind of come a long way from just taking pictures out of a spacecraft. In 2005, Google Earth released they acquired a company called Keyhole Incorporated, which had developed this set of mosaic images of the entire Earth. Now that there had been satellites, and they mosaicked everything together. Google bought Keyhole and made something called Google Earth, which completely revolutionized and transformed the way the average person, the average user, kind of interacts with maps. Before Google Earth and before MapQuest and Bing Maps and things like this, people were using paper maps everywhere. And the big deal here is that Google Earth kind of transformed it from print or kind of two-dimensional maps into something that you feel like you can almost touch. And in 2008, when I was still in college, they came out with a street view, which we all thought was really creepy, but now it's kind of ubiquitous and everybody expects it, where all of the mosaic images from the ground are even incorporated into this globe. And so why do I start here? Well, GIS is really, it's geographic information systems, and it all comes down to how do we represent what's on the Earth? How can we measure it? How can we kind of abstract it? And so I thought I'd bring us down to the ground for a second and kind of just talk about something seemingly simple, like this is a picture of a stream in Mongolia, right? So this stream, let's pretend we wanted to map this stream. A stream is an object, right? So there's two different kinds of phenomena we tend to map. There's objects and then kind of field phenomena. So the object in this is a stream. The field phenomena, which means something you can kind of test everywhere, might be something like elevation, where an object is either in a spot or not in a spot, and field phenomena is something you can kind of measure everywhere. So with computers, if we wanted to represent that stream, we might try to represent it in what's called a raster model. And a raster model is kind of like a picture. It's a number of cells that are all in an array, and we give those cells different values. Like perhaps in this case, the 1 here represents the stream, and maybe this 2 is a tributary that we can't see. There is another model, though, that does it a little bit easier, and that's called the vector data model. And the vector data model just kind of draws things in points and lines and polygons. Now, for that elevation, though, if we wanted to measure elevation, how would we do that? Well, the raster data model actually does a pretty good job at this field continuous data type of thing. Because there's a cell for every location, you can kind of populate that with different heights, or, you know, if this wasn't elevation, it could be rainfall. It could be any number of things that you want to measure everywhere. Temperature is another good one. And you can represent field phenomena in the vector data model as well. It's just a little more tricky. A lot of times you'll see it as contours. So what is GIS and what is cartography? So we've learned that there's ways we can represent the Earth on a computer and do digital cartography in GIS. So what's the difference between GIS and cartography? So to get at that, I'm going to tell a quick story. The first part of the story is going to take some imagination. So let's imagine there are 3 towns, and these 3 towns are represented by each of these 3 points. And the dotted line around the edge here is kind of our neat line. It's our map. It's kind of what we're looking at. Those 3 towns are surrounded by a forest, and those 3 towns that are surrounded by the forest also have roads that connect them. So what I've done already is just shown you 3 pieces of imaginary geographic information, and now we're seeing them all together in what we might consider a geographic information system. This information system has a bounding box, it lines them all up, and you can see them all at once. Now, these towns might have a problem, and that problem is that they want to know who controls how many kilometers of roads that go through the forest. Perhaps the forest is more, maybe there are branches that come down, or there's more maintenance that happens in the woods, and they have a simple question. For each town, how many kilometers of roads go through the forest? Well, to answer that question, we might get a boundary file, and maybe this red boundary file tells us the boundaries of the towns instead of the centers of the towns. Using that boundary file, we might alter the roads so that we take that roads file and chop it by this boundary file, and that tells us where each one of these sets of roads goes through each town. But then we want to find just where they go through the forest. So we might do what's called an intersect, and we can chop out those roads by the forest. And now we see the roads by town by forest. And so what I've just taken you through there might sound complicated, but it's a pretty straightforward GIS analysis. And so what I'm showing you right now at the end here is a map. And if we were going to kind of take the information we learned and try to show it to somebody, we would probably want to create a good looking map, and we wouldn't want to have to take them through all of our steps, right? We wouldn't want to have to drag them through all these data. Looks like a laser show. It's kind of obnoxious, right? What we want to see is just one good map that tells the whole story. So what I try to communicate to people is that mapping is two things. It's GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, which is very analytic and kind of problem solving. It's very similar to using Excel or other statistical software packages. You manipulate the data, you try to figure things out with it, and you can arrive at an answer, right? Our answer here might just be a table that says 8 kilometers, 20 kilometers, and 2 kilometers. Maybe that's all we need, and the GIS helped us get there. Cartography, however, is kind of more about design and synthesis. So once we have the information that we've gathered, how do we communicate that information to people? And if GIS is similar to Excel and kind of like a statistical software, and cartography is most similar to graphic design and information design. I always like to use metaphors. So I always think of GIS as kind of like carpentry, like you're making a structure or a building, and that might be your argument or it might be your analysis. And cartography is more like kind of finish work. It's either painting or varnishing or something that you're enhancing the thing that you've made. And if you do your job right, it should look good and not one way or the other. It shouldn't be too much and it shouldn't be too little. It should look really good. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Sophie in just a second, but I want to ask you another question kind of similar to what we looked at before. I think you all recognized the Earth when you first saw it. And it's okay, I know everybody's muted, but does anybody recognize this? And if you do, maybe just thumbs up in the chat window or something. I don't expect many people to recognize this. And if I told you this was a map, you might think, yeah, that's not a map, that's just a blob, right? As soon as I give you the next piece though, now I think probably everybody recognizes that this is Japan. The point I'm trying to make here is that in a GIS, these shapes are just geometric figures, right? It takes us as people to kind of assign values and meaning to them, right? If I used a GIS and told the GIS program that this was a Japan and these were all separate islands, and I named those islands, I could then measure the area of each and come up with something meaningful to people. Otherwise, it is all ultimately to the computer just a bunch of polygons, lines, and points. So I'm going to leave you with the first map I made of Mongolia for Elizabeth Endicott, and this was for her book in the history of land use in Mongolia. And I didn't know that at the time I was working at Middlebury College, and this was the first map. It was actually one of the first maps I made for money, which got me started on my whole career. And this is all I knew about Mongolia before I went. And I think you can kind of tell at this point that without the labels, you might, because you all are familiar with Mongolia, recognize it as Mongolia. But it took for me the labels to kind of understand what types of landscape features there were here. So I'll hand it over to Anne-Sophie for her to talk about her work with historical cartography in Mongolia. And at the end, I'll share a little bit about what I did when I was there in 2013. So I hope you're still with me and not too lost. But thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
all right.
Thanks, Ben. That was fascinating. I love to see the deconstructed and polished, beautifully laid out maps at the end of the presentation. It was cool. So my presentation will be much less sophisticated in terms of technology. In my work, I'm using a bit of GIS, but very basic feature to complement my work as a historian. So my project examines the production of local maps in Qing, Mongolia from the late 18th to the early 20th century. So this research takes us to Khalkha Mongolia in Qing era. And as Natso mentioned, I was an ACMS affiliate in 2017, 2018. I spent a year mostly at the National Archives of Mongolia, the National Library, and other institutions to document the process of map making at the time. So in addition to the maps that are in Mongolia, many local Mongol maps are scattered in libraries around the world. There are actually more than 800 local maps that are still extant, and we find important collections in Japan, Germany, and other places. So the material I'm using for this research includes mostly maps like these ones, but also documentary records in Mongolian, Manchu, and Chinese that tell the story of how the maps were made, which I then situate in the larger literature on historical cartography in the early modern world. So here's a map of the administrative geography of Qing Mongolia that was divided into leagues or imacs and banners or hosho. They're equivalent to counties, a bit larger than modern day sums. So the maps I look at and the maps I'm going to be talking about today are mostly banner maps. So just wanted to get the terminology right here. So in a minute, we'll be visualizing a number of historical maps and we'll unpack them using a bit of digital tools. Digital humanities, as we know, can support the work of historians in many ways. Let me highlight two of them today: the presentation of the material and data analysis. Much has been written on textual analysis using text mining, but today I'll be focusing on GIS for the purpose of historical cartography. So I'll first introduce some Mongol cartographic material. Then I'll elaborate on cases where GIS and other techniques of visualization have contributed to my analysis. But I'll also emphasize that digital tools alone are insufficient without traditional historical methods. Both sets of methods are, of course, complementary to each other, and I'll elaborate on this in a minute. And this will also give an overview of my PhD dissertation work, which I'm now converting into a book manuscript. So first, let's introduce a bit of maps. We'll take a moment to look at them and try to guess their chronological order. So these are 4 locally produced Mongol maps of the Qing era that come roughly from the same region, the Setsenhan Imac in eastern part of Mongolia. These maps were all made by local Mongols who inhabited the places that they drew. They were made mostly by jasaks or banner heads and their assistants, tuslach. As you can see, the maps look very different. And in fact, they were produced 127 years apart. So temporal variation explains most of the differences in addition to regional variation. So can you guess a bit what the chronological order is of the maps? I'm not gonna quiz you. I'm just gonna give you the answer right away, but it's just a way for us to get into, like slowly get into the type of material. So first we have this map of the Setsenhan League from 1780. And then we have second map, from 1840.
Like.
Yeah, sorry, is that working?
Yeah,
And
sorry, I was just trying to venture a guess. D looked like it was very sophisticated, but yeah.
Oh yes, I'm curious to hear your guess, Natso. What's the, yeah.
Oh, so yeah, I thought D was the most recent, but I'm surprised that B was the most recent, but I guess they're closer.
Yeah, good observation. D is much more colorful, has more detailed representation of the relief. But by the end of my presentation, you should understand why and how come we get this particular trajectory of map making with maps like B as the most recent ones. So yeah, thanks for trying. Right. So this series of maps raises a couple of questions that my research addresses. First of all, how did local map making in Mongolia change over time? How and why were maps produced? How did mapping intersect with the physical environment of the Khalkha Mongol steppe? And how does this material make us rethink the history of Khalkha Mongolia? So here's a slide that illustrates in greater detail the trajectory of the local maps. They're all regional maps of a single banner, the Wizenwang banner. So we isolate here the regional variation. And in my written work, I situate these different mapping pulses in their historical context and try to reconstruct the story of map making and why the maps look like they do actually here. So to get a sense of how this story unfolds, let's get back to the first map we saw, map A, dated from 1780. This is one of the oldest locally produced Mongol regional map that's available to us, to researchers today. It's also the starting point of my research. It was never studied or published until now. It represents the Setsenhan Aimak that covers roughly 130,000 square mile, a territory as big as the country of Greece for people following us from Europe. Interestingly, it was, as we can see here, it was not oriented sharp north, but slightly tilted to the northwest. So I performed here some very basic georeferencing using QGIS to situate the map on a modern day plane. And this illustrates actually how the orientation of the map slightly deviates from a north-south vertical axis. So what appears to be a slight deviation actually, I argue, holds the key to understanding the main ideas underpinning the making of the map. What do I mean? Let's take a look a bit. Let's take a closer look at the map itself. Oh, right. So we find here that the map follows the orientation of the Headland River. So anyone familiar with Eastern Mongolia today will have encountered the Headland River, which is a stronghold of pastoral economy in Eastern Mongolia. Today, 110,000 people live in the Headland River Basin in Mongolia only, in addition to some in Inner Mongolia. So the social and environmental and political importance of this river is reflected on this historical map, as the river features in the center of the map and acted as the horizontal dividing axis of the map. The river also dictated the multiple perspectives of the map. So north of the river here, geographical features like mountains are facing the map viewer, and south they're upside down. So we need to turn the map around to have a face view of all features. These different perspectives can be described as worm's eye view or a view from the ground as opposed to a bird's eye view. In this case, I would even say that it's like a duck's eye view or a view from a duck alternating between swimming on the river or flying above. There's other information we can extract from the maps. I'll just give a quick overview here. Here we have the frontier posts on the Russian frontier and south bordering Silingol. The administrative units, banners that I just mentioned are also illustrated on the map here. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, banners were fundamental political and ecological units of Mongolia in the Qing era. As we can see here, the banners are localized in space, but not bounded. The inscriptions in Mongolian situate each banner in relation to one another. The author of the map also listed the number of men in each banner who could serve in the military. And in fact, from the documents in the archives, we learned that this map was commissioned by the Qing Board of War and executed by a Mongol official based in Sezenhan. So using GIS combined with close reading of the map helps us understand its organizing principle and what the author of the map chose to emphasize. Here's another example of a map from a later period in 1890. It's much smaller. This is a reproduction. It's not the original. It's held at the Mandalgov Provincial Museum, showing the Daichin base of banner of Tusiethan League. So using Google Earth, I georeferenced it, which allows to locate some of the geographical features that appeared on the map, such as these landmarks that are still here today. So you can find some correspondences. There are other things we can do with digital tools, and they don't have to be very advanced techniques. So for example, it's possible to extract information and illustration from the maps. So here on this slide, I isolated some presentation of mountains and compare them with pictorial illustrations of mountain in Buddhist illustrated texts, specifically the White Beryl Sutra. And we can observe how the artistic influence of Buddhist art was very present in the first half of the 19th century. So these are mountains from Buddhist Sutra, and then decreased over time as standardization pressure increases on mapmaker. So I'll get into it in a minute. Data visualization help us to find out about some trends and patterns in mapping aesthetic that would be harder to demonstrate using maybe just only documentary analysis. So visualization help us compare maps and find pattern of change. For example, this case bring together like two maps from different times. The first, the earliest and the latest that I showed in the chronological guessing activity earlier. So we're going to zoom now on the later map, this one of the Sezenhan banner. Yeah. So if we close read it a little bit, we can see that it has a uniform bird's eye view where all the geographical features and textual inscriptions can be read from a point above the map and on the center. It was drawn using a scale and a grid marked with red squares. Oh, I see there's some chat. Okay, I'll get to the chat questions at the end. So it all on its contour, it also yeah, so it included, of course, the administrative seat of the banner, the elevation of mountain, roads, and more. On its contour, it includes an elaborate system of boundary demarcation, where the author of the map had to create exact correspondences between boundary points on the map, on the ground here in the form of ovals, and on a legend accompanying the map. Here's one of the legends. It's a small portion. It's usually a much longer document that marks the location of each oval or boundary markers, marks also distances and orientation between each oval using a calendar system called the 24 direction system. So these two maps, drawn 127 years apart, follow the completely different system of geographical correspondences. But still, they have many things in common. Namely, they were both made by local officials, Jasak and their assistants, who were not trained, not experts in cartography, but yet they contained information on the local geography, local administration did not appear on imperial maps, such as those produced by the Jesuits or the maps that feature in Qing empire-wide atlases called Huidiantu. So why then? Why did the aesthetic of the map vary to such an extent? To answer this question, I rely on traditional historical methods and read archival documents that tell the story of all these maps were made. So let me tell a bit more on this larger story that my project is telling based on these documents. So letters like the ones we see here between state and local officials reveal an increasing pressure for standardization coming from different agencies in Beijing. These state-imposed mapping standards aim to significantly reduce the influence of local perspectives, local color, like familiarity with the landscape, to obtain more of a continuous and homogeneous geographical representation of the Mongol steppe. However, as you've seen on the maps I've shown, the local perspectives were never fully erased and kept shaping how the maps were made, and most importantly, what the local map artists were able to include in them. Local banner level officials did much more than just fulfill mapping instruction. They actively negotiated the mapping standards and sometimes pushed back even against what they deemed as inappropriate or unfeasible, especially in terms of scale, size of the map, inclusion or exclusion of different features. Meanwhile, state agencies, Qing state agencies actually kept working towards the goal of creating geographical homogeneity across the entire realm of the Qing. For example, the Foreign Office or the Zhongliamen sought to bring together the maps of the coastal and terrestrial frontiers of the Qing in, or so-called, what they called frontiers in 1860s. This Qing state then moved to expand those continuities to represent uniformly the Mongol banners, imax, alongside with provinces, prefectures, and counties of China proper. But because the local Mongol maps were so embedded in local practices, always drawn by those who lived in the place they recorded, the desired level of continuity never completely happened, as Mongol banners never comprehensively featured in the Qing Imperial Atlas. For a quick comparison, here are two maps of the Chinese province and prefecture from the Huidiantu Atlas of 1799. They all neatly fitted in one page, while the equivalent Mongol maps could never really fit with the scale of those provinces and prefectures, were fragmented and appeared on multiple pages of the atlas, but they remain very legible in their Mongolian context. This process of negotiation between the local ad hoc map makers and the state helped shaped how the maps were made. Specifically, maps stemmed from a succession of mapping pulses that gradually created a coherent system of cartographic representation in Mongolian that diverged from latitude and longitude and also differed from mapping practices in China proper. This system could be implemented by local Mongol officials. So this explains why a group of people, this process of standardization explains why a group of people in the same territory, less than 17 years apart, would first draw their land like this. And then, after receiving instruction from the central state, redrew it completely differently 17 years later, like this. As you can see now, the map includes a scale, a grid, red labels for boundaries, place name, and so on. Right, so I'm gonna stop the share for a short conclusion. This presentation offered an overview of the combination of digital methods like GIS and more basic techniques in the analysis of historical cartography in Khalkha Mongolia and the Qing era. These techniques, combined with traditional historical methods, help us visualize, understand, and interpret the trajectory of change of these local maps. In this case, it also helps us understand the crucial role that local Mongol actors like Jasaks and their assistants played in drawing maps of their local banners. I'll stop here, and I look forward to hearing your questions, comments, feedbacks, or suggestions on my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Pratte. Okay, I will now turn to Mr. Meader's presentation.
All right, thank you, Anne-Sophie. Yeah, so I hope everybody can kind of see, well, right now I'm just sharing a black screen, but it's going to be a little bit more of a storytelling thing here because it was quite a while ago that I was in Mongolia. So I'll try to bring you through the kind of what I did while I was there in 2013, and then also just some thoughts about kind of digital cartography, so kind of modern what does it mean to be a modern or digital cartographer? So I just bring you back to this first map I made of Mongolia. I think when I got there, or before I got there, when I made this map for Tina, I had this concept of, okay, desert, steppe, that there was this gradient from kind of the Gobi Desert up into the mountains, and then some rivers flowing north and that kind of thing. When I arrived, I realized that as it often happens when I make maps of places I've never been, you show up and you realize you don't know very much at all about the places that you've made a map of. And so I remember the contrast when I got to UB was very stark, and I was amazed at the differences between kind of this dense urban area and then the vast countryside. So one of the first things I did when I got to Mongolia was kind of do a big database dump and find as much information as I could about Mongolia. And I made a new map, kind of without labels, but just throwing together as many different types of things as I could think of to put together to get a better kind of feel of the landscape, just for myself. And what this is, it might look simple, and it kind of is, but it's actually about 5 or 6 different layers blended together. There still is kind of that what we call a hypsometric tint, which is just the elevation changing color as it goes up, to mimic that kind of desert to steppe, or desert steppe, and then taiga. But then also I added some land cover information on top of that to try to understand, yes, there's a lot of forest around and that kind of thing. And so after I made this map, I got to go out I was actually almost 8 years ago this weekend on a hike, just to kind of get out of the city a little bit and try to understand more about the natural landscape. And so after going on a hike, I shared this photo with one of my very good friends who's a hunting guide in Alaska, and first thing he noticed was how heavily grazed the landscape is. I think when I looked at this, the first thing I saw was, okay, cool, trees, steppe, it's beautiful. And he saw these thin lines kind of all over the land, and that's something you see in a lot of different grassland areas with lots of animal population. And so then, I kind of had this map that gave me a different kind of romantic sense of what I thought the land might be like in Mongolia in different places. And I could look at Google Earth and look at some aerials, but then I thought, well, yeah, I guess livestock is it's a huge part of especially the rural Mongolian economy. And so what I wanted to do then was create a series of maps that showed population density in Mongolia. And luckily, it was really easy to find population of people. And of course, Mongolia is widely regarded as one of the most sparsely populated countries in terms of people per square mile in the world. But these are kind of what I call single variable maps. So there's always problems with single variable maps, which means that we're only showing one relationship, right? So this is people per square mile, where we can see kind of, okay, yes, there's less than 2 people per square mile for many, many, many places. But of course, it's by sum, right? So it's by this large area. So there's some variation there. But what I was really interested in was, well, can we figure out what some of the population, the national population of different animals are? And there actually was a really great database, Livestock Census, that went back to the 1970s that was very detailed. The problem is that it was all in Cyrillic alphabet, which I didn't know. And so I took a month-long course, which is not nearly enough time to learn very much. But I learned the Cyrillic alphabet and a few dozen words and that kind of thing. But mostly it was so that I could get the data, which was identified by IMAG and then SUM, and get that to what we call join. I joined it to these SUM boundaries. So using those, I spent most of a month trying to get just this one operation to work, which was a join. But what that let me see is the main herd composition. Horses, camels, goats, sheep, and cattle or yak. And this relationship isn't necessarily that meaningful, but I kind of wanted to see per capita what the different herd compositions are on average throughout Mongolia. And so, we've got horses and camels, which tend to be more towards the south in the kind of desert landscape. Cattle and yaks. This is the mountain, central mountain range, and then sheep and goats. And I had started to learn a little bit about the goat population and how there was a shift happening in southern Mongolia, and goats are prized for cashmere. And so there's some interesting things that I kind of learned about that. While I was in UB, I did a whole bunch of different projects that didn't have to do with the rural landscape. I did I won't go into terrible detail, but I worked on with the Asia Foundation on kind of an infrastructure mapping project. I worked to identify, I think they're called deer stones, and we did a thing where we looked at a bunch of tables and turned them into geographic information points. But one of the most interesting things I ran into, her name's Ariel Ahern, and she was doing a project in the southern, in Bayanhungar. And Bayanhungar is this IMAC right here. Probably everybody already knows that, but, and she was doing work in Ulzit Sun, which Ulzit, or I think it's the first Bak, which is the first district of Ulzit Sun, which is this area right up in here. And so she asked me if I wanted to come along, and I, of course, was very excited to do so. And so we got on a bus and rode 12 hours down to Ulzit Sun, and we spent, I think it was 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks with very wonderful family in Ulzit, and then also out in one of their seasonal gers in the countryside. And so after the bus ride, we got down there, and this is Ariel, and this is a man named Loya. And Loya was a Sun director, to the best of my knowledge, from what I can remember. And it was his job to go to every family during a transition period. And this was the transition from the fall site to the winter site, I think it was, when a lot of families are moving from one place to another. And Ariel studied land use and human economics and all that kind of stuff. And she was interested in how do political entities kind of manage different pastoralists, and manage people who are actually still using different methods to raise livestock. And so what we did is he drove us all around. We went, well, actually, I'll just show you. He drew this map all from his head, which I was very impressed by. And these were all the families that he was going to go visit. And from what it looks like to me, and I didn't speak fluent Mongolian by any stretch of the imagination. So he drew this just from his memory of where he would go from one ger to another ger to another ger to another ger. And these were where all of the different families lived. And so we were going to go to each of these families in this one bak of this one sun, and take information about how many livestock each family had, if they had, what the herd composition was, and a bunch of different attributes like that. And so, of course, it was one of the times as a 25-year-old, a young cartographer, I got to make my first map that I got to actually use to navigate on the ground, because out in Bayanhungar, there's no cell service, obviously. And there besides a Google Earth image, there really wasn't much data. There were some elevation data, so I could make a little bit of, kind of topographic information. But then we ended up, they suited me up, of course, in a ger, which I thought was wonderful, and I still have, actually. And then we rode around on a motorcycle for the better part of 3 weeks. I'm going to every family and interviewing them, and kind of learning about their different sites that they're going from, the fall site to the winter site, and different reasons for different spots like that. And this is just an image of, this is the car we rode around in. This is Loya's car, the bag director. And so they're packing up the ger right now, or I don't know if they're setting it up or taking it down, but in transition from one site to another. So why would we have to go in person to all these places? Well, a lot of geographic data, as I hope maybe you can kind of understand from my earlier lecture, is that it's collected at a broader scale, right? Aerial photos are taken by satellites or airplanes. There's a lot of information you get at the state level, like the boundaries and hydrography and things like that. But if you want to get information about people, you really do need to go and be on the ground. And so these are all of the sites we visited. I think there were about 60 to 70 sites. And then when we got back, we were able to categorize them. So for every site, let's see if I can find it if you can remember, Ariel was taking very detailed notes about every site. And so I was able to take those notes and combine them with the GIS data to categorize them by fall sites, where were people in the fall, where were people in the winter, a little bit more spread out, where were people in the summer, and in the summer they're much more gathered towards the river, and in kind of winter and fall, where were the wells located? Was there a reason that they needed to be near the wells? And then, of course, we had lots and lots of photos that kind of helped describe what we were seeing on the map, so we could remember. The other stuff is, this kind of gets into thematic cartography. I was interested in, can we map different volumes of animals on the landscape? And so with those same different points, here's an example of the winter sites with the herds and the herd composition. So the size of this circle represents the relative size of the herd, and the color represents which kind of animal is in each different area. So many more goats kind of along this rougher terrain here, more sheep out in the open, that kind of thing. And it's a small study area, so there wasn't a lot we could draw from this besides it just being an interesting way to kind of see the landscape. And just to add another term to your kind of bag of tricks, I guess, we would call GIS is the manipulation of the analysis side of using the data. Cartography is kind of a final product. I would call what we're doing right now is called Geo Visualization, which means we're not trying to make a pretty map. We're just trying to see the data better. And so Geo Visualization is trying the data out in different ways to see what it looks like. So here's the same exact data, except now I'm showing it as a set of bar charts instead of pie charts. And so it kind of shows you the relative, you can kind of compare the linear scale a little bit easier. And then, okay, so I guess then we'll just see here. Here's all the sites. I did a whole bunch of different tests of what I wanted to kind of experiment with. One of the ones I didn't get a chance to do, I had to go back to Maine before I was able to try it. But there's a really interesting kind of look at this. This probably looks like absolute gobbledygook to everybody. But what this shows is by color, different single families and kind of what is the pattern of mobility for everybody. Right? Some people, are they moving close or far? How far apart are winter sites from fall sites versus summer sites and that kind of thing. And again, this is such a small study area that there are people that move outside of the study area. So you can't, and that's the problem. We always try to contain things to one study area, and it's much more complex than that. So in mobility, we also got to record whether people were traveling by car or motorcycle or by horse, and that was kind of interesting too. So I thought, just kind of as a last thing, I actually just remembered that I did pull up this map. I got a chance to make one more map for Elizabeth Endicott back in 2019 or 2020, I think it was. And this was kind of, I just wanted to take you under the hood at what digital cartography is like, right? So digital cartography is just individual layers. This is a map for a book, but it's really all these layers kind of get stacked on top of each other. And so I'm going to kind of peel the map down to nothing and show you how it's built from the bottom. So whenever I make a map, I start with usually a blank page, and I don't know why that's, oops, there we go, a blank page. And then we kind of, one of the most important things is to define what's called the publishing dimension. How big is this going to be? And that's an actual number of inches by number of inches. And then the geographic area, which in this case was all of Northern Asia, that relationship to the publishing dimension gives you the scale. So the scale is a direct relationship between how big you're publishing your map and the size of the geographic area you're representing. So if we were, it doesn't seem like a very complex map. It is kind of just a basic reference map, but I'm going to show you that there's kind of a lot that goes into it. So the first thing that I did is I went and found a very nice land cover data set from something called Natural Earth, which is, you should all write that down. Natural Earth is wonderful. It is a free and open set of information that anyone can use, and it's great for what we call small scale mapping, meaning mapping small scale, large extent, mapping very wide areas, very large areas. And it's just a great resource if you want to make basic maps yourself. And so they have this really nice representation of kind of the Earth and the color of the Earth. But, oh, here we go. It's actually just this piece. And then we added on top of this, what's called a hill shade that gives kind of a ruffled look to the landscape. So those two were added together. And then we wanted an older feel. So we gave it a sepia tone, which is just a tint across the whole thing. And then to ground it, we gave it a graticule. And the graticule kind of shows you the shape of the Earth a little bit so that you can kind of get a sense of how we're in the Northern Hemisphere, and it gives you a sense of scale. And then you kind of add all of these hydrographic features in together. We'll start with the ocean, because that's the most obvious in defining, perhaps. And then we can add the rivers, and then there's some special rivers that are a little bit bigger because they overlap with the boundary, some lakes, and then some glaciers down here in the Himalayas, and then the country borders like that. And some of the country borders go over that, which was a little tricky. And then we add, I think the only features we have here are cities. And I don't even know if I guess we didn't even add any cities in that one. It's just an empty layer. We added this was the Trans-Siberian Railway. This map was used for reference in a narrative in a book, and this was the most important part to kind of highlight. And then, of course, what really makes a map come together, I think, are labels. People really respond, I find, very immediately. As soon as the label's on a map, it starts to feel real to people. So we have country labels, and those tend to be kind of all caps and spread out. We've got a couple of darker country labels because they're so small, they weren't showing up. So we made the color darker. Water labels, so we can see all of these different bodies of water. Physical feature labels. So we've got the Himalayas, the Plateau of Tibet, Desert Nagobi, and rivers, river labels, city labels, and then the label of the railway. And then once you put a layout around it, it starts to feel like a real thing. So anyway, this is to just kind of show that there's not really any magic to maps. They're just lots of time and lots of layers of information that all get very particular styles. And that's kind of how you take this geographic information and put it together. So yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to answer any questions about what, just like Anne-Sophie, about the work that I did when I was in Mongolia, but yeah, it was a while ago. So I had to sync to some old folders, and that's all I could pull up for today. So,
and this is a really fascinating field as well. So happy to answer the questions coming in from. So I actually have a question here from Bob McIntosh. Is it possible that the orientation of the map's true north is provided by the North Star?
Right. I think that's a really interesting hypothesis. I would need to verify that and actually check what the orientation of the polar star is. I assume, well, I concluded that the orientation followed the river because the river also orients the perspectives of the map. So that second hypothesis seemed more coherent to me, but thanks for the suggestion. I'll definitely look into this.
Yeah, I have a lot of things. First of all, thank you for both of the speakers. It was very interesting, very illuminating to learn both about the practical side of GIS and some analysis of historical sources. Both super interesting for me. I wanted to add something about the orientation feature or hypothesis, and maybe try to kind of combine the issue of orienting to landscape features with the question of why the orientation would be, I'm not saying that necessarily in all cases, but in many cases why it would be, you know, slightly off the cardinal reference points. Yeah, the way I understand it, and that I saw other researchers also kind of pursue this hypothesis, is that the first thing is that because the orientation not only, you know, in terms of conceptualizing the spatial cognition, but also in practical terms, how you, for example, the basic, most simple example, how you orient the gers, which would usually be more or less to the south, how that can help us clarify the orientation of the maps. So what happens very often is that even though you know, traditionally the ger is supposed to be oriented south, it happens that due to the landscape features, for example, a certain valley opening up into this or that direction, the orientation of the ger would slightly differ. And then also because all of the households are oriented into a similar direction, which is perceived as the south, then the orientation, the spatial cognition shifts in you know, the local population's understanding of the landscape, and this is one of the reasons why the maps can be slightly off the cardinal reference points. Yeah, I'm not saying in all of the cases, but that might also be, you know, a good cue to follow up maybe. I'm not sure if like the North Star itself would be a I haven't heard about people using this as a reference point, but it would be very interesting to actually find out that that is true. And maybe, you know, not to hold the mic, the floor, whatever, for too long. I just wanted to say that it is very interesting to see what Ben was talking about in the beginning, that with the shift from traditional, let's say, paper-based cartography to digital-based GIS, you know, technologies and representations, there is this change of perspective from you know, us viewing the landscape to you know, very often, for example, in Google Maps, us being like the main central reference point for the landscape, and we can you know, modify how we see the surroundings based on our location. And this is very interesting for me to compare that with the traditional way of perception of space in Mongolian culture. Is that because, you know, it's such a dispersed society, it is very hard to speak of a univocally speak of one center. Yeah, so very often the center is going to be different for different people, and usually the ger would be the central point. Yeah, so for me this raises this interesting question, like how does this shift in technology allow traditional knowledge to be more adjusted to, or the representations to be more adjusted to the traditional ways of perceiving space and landscape. And it would be very interesting to see some follow-ups on, you know, how cognition is mirrored, or how it can find new ways of expression in these new user-centered cartographies, like GIS could be, for example. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing to look into for me. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for now. Maybe not too much. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me maybe just respond to the orientation question. It's a Yeah, it's a great point, and you're right. For some maps, south or a slightly off variation of a north-south orientation that follows the gear, like the orientation of the gear, the door facing the south is used for some maps, and it actually follows the direction of the wind across the steppe, so that the door is oriented the opposite side of where the wind comes from. That's definitely true for some of the maps that I've seen that are oriented either south or a bit off the southern direction. And how the ovals are numbered very often follows this like south on top way of viewing space. I would still maintain that this is not the case for the map that I show, that's actually oriented towards the north and has a different set of perspectives on Eastern Khalkha Mongolia that is put forward on this map. But you're right that there are a variety of ways to orient the map, and this, like the opening of the gear, the way of ordering the cardinal direction definitely matters in how some of the maps were made. But yeah, thank you so much for this, for adding this information to the discussion. Great.
Thank you. Yeah, and of course, Mr. Schaap also presented a very fascinating topic recently. So it's actually soon to be available on our YouTube channel. So thank you, Pavel. All right, so next we have Mr. Alan Wheeler. I'm going to add you to the spotlight, and please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, this is probably more for Anne-Sophie. And also it is related to what Pavel was saying about the directionality of maps. And whenever the Qing started to heavily enforce mapping of more and more territory and the demarcation of boundaries according to the ovos, according to Shagdarsurung and Dolum and Seti Shell, as well as Galbadrch, they connect the, they talk about how it's oriented towards the south. But of course, that same directionality with the 12 mountains, with the cardinal directions, with the different colors, male, female colors, all of those actually quite nicely map onto a Luopan compass for Feng Shui mapping. If you look at a Luopan compass, it's exactly the same zodiac of that's found. It's probably it also has the trigrams. So it's got ancient connections also to the Book of Changes, or I Ching, Taoism, and of course the Qing dynasty mandating that they had to do the Earth is square and the heavens are round sort of thing for mapping out or drawing the map first. But what I find fascinating about that is when the Qing went west. Okay, so from Inner Mongolia upwards and from Eastern Mongolia westwards, they really couldn't do any of this mapping until they got rid of the Oir and the Zungar Empire, and even the Treaty of Kyatka, the central oval that they put on the border between Qing Mongolia and Russia. From that central oval going eastwards, there's something like 60 some odd ovals that were put along the northern border, and from that oval going westward, there's only like 24, all the way across the border between Uriankhai and the Hovd territories. And the further west you go, whenever they were establishing garrisons, for example, the Hovd garrison, the Qing garrison in Hovd, the wall is still there, the ruins of the wall, and it's oriented south, just like everybody thinks Mongol gers are supposed to be facing south. But there's a Qing and Khalkha Mongol orientation, because if you look at all of the houses, all the gers, and even the current, the modern, the state palace or the Ima provincial capital building is facing to the east. And so most of your Western Mongols have their doors open facing east, but it is their south. And none of that is, if you look at the maps that they made during this period you're talking about, none of that is shown. And so in other words, the locals were not involved in map making in Western Mongolia. It was the Qing and the Khalkha who were imposing a kind of directionality, their own south, which is the locals east, onto the Oret and also the I mean, for Pete's sake, they barely got over the Haruls to get into the Uriankhai territory. But if you get to look at the maps of Uriankhai, you know, I think it's Purdue who says that, you know, you can see that the maps are indigenous and Mongolian, and you can tell that they're Mongolian because first you've got the Mongolian script, and then you get the Chinese translation or the labels attached on top of the maps in Chinese and Manchu to translate it. But that's baloney. You don't have any Tuvan linguistic place names on those geographical representations that were imposed by the Khalkha and the Qing on Western Mongols and the Uriankhai, or the Tuvan people. So it's basically the Khalkha Mongols using the Qing power and legitimacy to take over further and further Western parts, which they were unable to do until the Dzungars were destroyed. Anyway, my point is that the fact that they still orient their gares towards the east, and they call what we would call the cardinal direction of east, they call that south, even in you know, local parlance in Western Mongolia, is proof that the locals were not involved in those mapping initiatives during the period you're talking about in the West, at least in my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. Next, were any of the speakers wanting to respond to that, or otherwise I'll do the next.
Sure. Yeah. I'll respond. I concentrated my research on Eastern Mongolia, Setsen Han and Tuset Han. I have not done extensive work on Western Mongolia, but in the documentary records clearly shows that the locals were involved in, well, the locals were authors of the maps that I presented. And in the case of the 4-direction system, I think, yeah, this is the 24-direction system here that I think that you mentioned that, yes, has some element of Chinese Taoism, Feng Shui, Bagua, and so on. This is a Mongol, oops, I don't know if, yeah, this is a Mongol.
Yeah, now I can see it, yeah.
Yeah. So, and this was introduced to Mongolia in the 11th century and was used also locally for a calendar system. So it can't really be said that this is Chinese per se, since there was a syncretism that was developed around that chart. I think there's more to say on comparing different maps across the different Mongol territories in Western Mongolia, but also in Inner Mongolia. I think they followed slightly different historical trajectories, but yes, like to clarify, my research is mostly centered on Eastern Khalkha.
Okay, thank you very much. So next we have Ms. Dagin Dor. I'll add you to the, here we go, spotlight, okay. And
thank you so much. Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for these wonderful presentations. I learned so much. As usual, Anne-Sophie, I'm a big fan of your work. I've been following you secretly. So I have two questions for the both of you. But first of all, let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm right now writing my dissertation at UC Santa Barbara Religious Studies Department. And my project actually is interested in mapping Buddhist sites and especially monasteries in Inner Mongolia in the early 20th century. And I'm also interested in using GIS and also network analysis, kind of trying to map not just the locations themselves, but also movements of people and the relationship between Buddhists across the Inner Asia and the East Asian kind of Buddhist landscape. So my question for Anne is, in the historical Qing maps of Mongolia, basically how enchanted were the landscapes? Like, what are the religious elements in it, and what are the kind of relationships between those regions to the rest of Buddhist Inner Asia, right? To Tibet, to Inner Mongolia, to Manchuria. Are there any clues that you see, for example, stupas or monasteries in these maps? So that's a question for Anne. For Ben, I have a question, more of a technical one. Do you know any projects, or do you have any advices on someone who wants to combine GIS mapping and network analysis, for example, ways to better visualize or to kind of engage with movements of people and also their relationships? That's it. Thank you so much, Rose. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a fascinating one. And yes, there are, like as I mentioned in my presentation, there are artistic influences coming from Buddhist illustration. Also, the perspectives, the way Buddhist sculptures are made, informed the way in which scale was drawn on the map. For example, in terms of connections with the rest of Inner Asia, like Tibet, I have not seen that many in the material that I've been looking at, but definitely, especially in the case of the earlier map, the pre-standardization map, you see a clear influence of Buddhist art on the ways in which the landscape was represented. In terms of the ritual, like the ovals are used extensively to demarcate banners, to serve up as boundary markers. So it's like a way in which one like ritual elements of the Mongols was kind of incorporated in this process of demarcating the banners in the 19th century. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Great, yeah, thank you for your question too. I guess the short answer would be, if you'd like to meet on Zoom, I would need to know more about kind of your project in particular, but I would be happy to just talk about it with you for a while. My immediate reaction when people say network analysis is, I think a lot of times, so in a GIS, a lot of network analysis is a very specific set of tools which are used to usually study traffic or service areas, or they're called OD cost matrices. They're ways of like comparing origins and locations on a network. And it is a network what you're talking about, but it sounds like it's also about a series of relationships. And so their GISs can be used to study networks, but there's also kind of social network data mining you can do, or data analysis, which is more about, and I'm going to use the word topology, not topography. So topography being the shape of the earth. Topology is the relationships of nodes and edges within a network. And from some of the social science research that I've not really done that particular type of analysis before, but we've looked into it because it's something it's different than a network analysis. Like a network analysis, somebody might say, okay, here's a road network. How far can you drive from any given point? And you get this kind of this blob shaped thing based on how fast you can drive on the road, or or if you were looking at utility networks or stream networks or things like that. So it might be related, the network analysis tools that you can use in a GIS for what you're describing. But it also sounds to me like you're talking almost like some kind of social network or a series of relationships. And that is still geospatial. But what's, I think, really fascinating about that, and I would love to learn more about it, is a lot of social changes. And I don't know if you're familiar with any of kind of geolinguistics work, or where there's these old atlases where people are showing the ways languages have changed and spread and things like that. There's kind of this older model of thinking, which used to be that where do people sound differently, right? Or like if they want to get accents, or if they wanted to get languages or things like that. But we know now that it's much more complex, right? People, based on their social standing, or based on who they know, or where they work, or how they get to work, people all live very in a complex web of kind of network relationship with other people. And so that kind of idea that on the ground you can have a one-to-one relationship with distance is, I think, at least in social geography, is kind of not the way people are looking at it now. It's more about what are the series of relationships we can study. And so mapping that might not be literal networks on the ground, but it might be about relating certain data sets to other data sets, or creating kind of, they call them like topological diagrams, so you can see that, right? So, I think this is some of the most interesting work you can do in this field, is when, yes, geographic space matters, but it's not necessarily the lat long coordinate, right? It's not exactly where on the earth you are. It's, oh, well, I have the ability to, I have the social agency to go meet with this person at this time. And what does that enable? What kind of action does that enable to happen? So I'm kind of just extrapolating here on what I imagine you're interested in. But if you'd like to talk more about that, I've always been really interested in, cultural things, but the way that's getting studied has changed dramatically in the last even 30 years or 40 years. So I'd love to hear more about it. Feel free to send me a message, and we could talk more. There's a lot of, I will say, the last thing I'll say, there's a lot of really great open source tools for this type of stuff. So if you're thinking, oh gosh, I get to find a really fancy license for this or that, like, yes, that's out there, but there's also a lot of open source software. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Ms.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Dagen. Of course, I also read your piece on the digital orientalists. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but so your work on digital humanities and Mongolian studies was very innovative, and it is really appreciated. So, and actually, one of the things we were discussing before the presentation was how genealogy, the Orgin Bichik papers, could also factor into GIS, geospatial analysis, or network analysis, even, because on network analysis, a lot of projects such as like Game of Thrones character relationships, right? Those are plotted out. So I'm sure something similar has happened within Mongolian Khanates, and I do mean the intrigues, murders, and everything, but yeah, something like that. And also the China biographical database, the Harvard University did. So that's also, I'm sure it's great. So yeah, there's a lot to be done in Mongolia, I'm sure. And it sounds like your dissertation is also going to be a very wonderful project. So thank you very much for that. Do we have any other questions?
I'd just like to thank you for organizing the panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natsu. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. And this was a very interesting panel. So I'm sure people who have missed it, especially in Mongolia, will be able to watch the replay and contact you for further inquiry, like Dagen did. So thank you very much. That's all for our event today. We have another English panel coming up in November on the Nomonhan incident, or the Khalkha battle. And in October, we'll have the Mongolian language event. So stay tuned for that. And otherwise, thank you very much. Have a good day. Have a good night.